Hello, Al Murray here. A quickie before we get started. Many of you get in touch with us looking for book recommendations, and we try to suggest 3 new ones each month. Our selection for October hopefully offers something for everyone. First up is Monty's Men by historian John Buckley. It tells the story of the British Army from D-Day to VE Day and takes a new and very fresh look at the quality of the men who fought from Normandy to the Baltic and how the army grew and developed. We think you'll find this take absolutely fascinating. It certainly opened my eyes. Next up is Volume 2 in Spike Milligan's legendary war memoirs. This one's called Rommel Gunner Who. It covers Milligan's time in Africa in 1943 during Operation Torch. If you enjoyed Adolf Hitler, My Part in His Downfall, you will love this. Book 3 is by a less well-known writer called Alexander Barron, who turned his experiences fighting with the Pioneer Corps into a series of novels and short stories. From the City, from the Plough tells the story of the Wessex Regiment, preparing for D-Day and then fighting its way through Normandy. Barron was brilliant at capturing the everyday lives and characters of the regular soldier, and this book paints a vivid picture of the boredom pre-battle and the sheer hell of fighting in the bocage. So there you are, 3 cracking reads for October. As usual, members of the Independent Company get all these books 20% off through Waterstones, and a big thank you to them. If you bought all 3, that would save you just over £6. Happy reading. Achtung, Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And I'm going to hand over to James now to do the introductions for our very special guest. James.
Well, yes, this is an old friend, and I dare I say it, mentor of mine, Professor Jeremy Black, who is something of a legend in the historical firmament, was also coincidentally at Durham when I was, and so taught me in early modern history over a number of different courses, and fantastic he was too. And then some years after you, I can't remember quite when you moved down to Exeter, Jeremy, but you took a post at Exeter. I then moved out of London. We sort of got back in touch, and we've sort of regularly met up, chewed the cud. I've kind of sort of lent on you for advice, and one of the things I do remember very clearly, one of the first things you were telling me about was how to stand up and give a public lecture. And I remember the 3 things you said was never, ever use PowerPoint for anything other than photographs. Never use any kind of words at all. Always explain what you're going to say before you start it. And start on a light note. And those are 3 things I've stuck to religiously. So I never, ever, ever use notes. Oh, that was the other thing. Never use notes. Always just stand up and deliver. And of course, that's the best advice of all, I think, because I think when you are standing up, and Al, obviously, as a performer, you'll know this, you've got to look people in the eye. And I think the best talks when you are, when you're delivering a historical talk, the best talks are when it is a performance rather than a kind of dry, monotone kind of reading off a script from a lectern kind of thing. Yeah. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to have you on, Jeremy. So thank you for joining us.
A pleasure, and I've never ever chewed the cud in my life. But anyway, let's go.
but one of the things I think is interesting, one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot over the years is sort of, I sort of felt I had a sort of different thesis on the Second World War, and fortunately it was one that you kind of sort of broadly agreed with. And I do think the kind of the narrative on the Second World War is changing a bit, isn't it, over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years?
Yes, I mean, what you've been doing is producing some marvellous campaign histories. And I think there was a while in which, as it were, the war became just a matter of war and society. The home front, Rosie the Riveter wins World War II, the idea that industrial production doomed the Axis to failure, etc., etc., so that in a sense the fighting didn't matter. And on top of that, you got the ludicrous accounts by Max Hastings suggesting that the Allied armies weren't very good, and that the Germans, who to the best of my knowledge lost the war, were in somehow better. So what I think has happened in recent years is people have pushed attention more to the actual nature of the fighting and what makes for fighting effectiveness, fighting cohesion. And that's come from a number of different directions, from both popular writers and from some academics. It's come in a number of countries. You've seen, for example, the marvelous work produced by a generation of American scholars on the Soviet army in World War II. And you've seen British scholars looking at, for example, the British Army in Burma, in North Africa, and in Western Europe, and providing much more bitty, granulated, consistently quality accounts than these broad brush treatments. And I think that's very important.
Isn't part of the problem, though? I mean, I did my history degree a long time ago, and there was no real opportunity to study the Second World War as a form of legit history. You know, military history has very often been seen as left for the chaps in red corduroys and so on, and not regarded as a thing for serious study. I'm right in thinking that, aren't I?
Well, I think you are, Al, yes. And I think given its significance of war to history as a whole, it is striking that it doesn't tend to always play a role. So that if you're thinking of some of the major universities, there's really very little military history, for example, at Cambridge. There's very little military history at Harvard, and so on. And one of the problems in the academic world is that the easiest way to get a job is to come through one of the more prestigious doctoral factories, if you like. And if you take the United States, there are, very good universities teaching military history, but they're not always the leading military universities. Same in Britain. I mean, for example, marvellous stuff on World War II at Wolverhampton. Gary Sheffield and his group done a marvellous job. But I think it's probably fair to say that a graduate of Wolverhampton unfairly will probably find it harder to get a job than an academic job than a graduate at Oxford.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? Because you think of the kind of sort of military historians that are at Oxford and Cambridge. I suppose, one thinks of kind of Hugh Strawn and people like that.
Well, he's retired.
He's retired. He has now retired. Then at Cambridge, you've got Professor Sir Richard Evans kind of holding court on the Nazis.
No, he's retired as well.
He's retired as well. Okay,
yes.
But he has been in recent years.
Yes.
But I mean, but he doesn't know anything about the military side of things. He knows a lot about the Nazis and what life was like in Germany and the Holocaust and all the rest of it. But his knowledge doesn't really extend to military operations at all.
No, I mean, to be fair to Richard Evans, he has retired. I don't think he would claim that. I mean, his background was doing research on cholera in the 19th century in Hamburg, which is what he did his initial very important work on. And then he moved into, as you say, the sort of domestic German aspect of the Third Reich. The difficulty is that, specifically on Germany, that those people who tend to specialise on the Nazi Party do not tend to really have an interest in military history. So if you're looking for good military historians on Germany writing in English on the Wehrmacht, you'd be looking at somebody like Robert Citino at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And I'm happy to be corrected on this because, I'm tired, and as I've just mentioned, I just had a granddaughter. But I don't think there's anybody in Britain at the level of somebody like Citino. I mean, looking at understanding the German army, understanding its in its long term, explaining why the German army wasn't particularly good in World War II, because one of Citino's themes is the Germans were structured for a short war, for operational military history, for in particular a war of manoeuvre and encirclement. And if they were up against people who couldn't be outmaneuvered or were able to outfight them, then
they were stuffed.
They were stuffed. And I mean, what's very interesting, you've worked on Sicily, Italy and Normandy. What's very interesting is that in each time, particularly Italy and Normandy, the Germans tried to drive in the bridgeheads And when that failed, they really didn't have much. They didn't have much left in their locker. They were conceptually rather arid. So, people always will tell you how good German fighting quality is. Now, you've got to be very careful here because we're talking about a large number of divisions. Fighting quality varied within those and between them. But on the whole, the Germans were much better at the tactical level than they were at the operational. And at the operational level, what people tend to do is to write up their successes, but don't say so much about their failures. And driving in a bridgehead is a pretty classic thing you need to be able to do quickly and to do well. And they had opportunities, for example, at Salerno. They bluntly had opportunities in France, given that they knew an invasion was going to come at some stage and that they had a lot of troops there, but they just didn't manage it. And and then their counterattacks when they came, in the Normandy case, for example, the Mortain counterattack, terribly badly handled.
Yeah. This is interesting, isn't it? Because military history, and particularly the military history of the Second World War, has been sort of eschewed by the academia. Some of these ideas that James is engaged in sort of trying to knock over, they've got their boots on and they've got round the world, haven't they? Is the thing, and there's some very set views, particularly about how the Germans handled the war, and this confusion of the tactical, the operational, strategic. That people think, well, they were good in a foxhole, so they were better.
Well, I agree with you entirely, Al. And can I just say, people will often tell you the victors get to write the history. In fact, that's absolute rubbish. The victors don't need to. They're on to running the world. The people that overwhelmingly write the history of the American Civil War tend to be these days on the Confederate side or pro-Confederacy. And what is bizarre is that the German and Japanese account of World War II, that in a sense that they were better, but that they were ground down by resources, that account has become the orthodoxy. I mean, it was polished by the German generals after World War II, and essentially the German generals, very crudely, but this is essentially what they did, said to the British and the Americans, we, the Germans, were brilliant, we were outstanding. Why then did we lose? Well, the Soviet Union's so big, and it was cold and there were a lot of them, and Hitler messed it up. Never a suggestion that they, in any way, were less than brilliantly competent. And the fact of the matter is they weren't fantastic. And I think it's quite interesting because a lot of I agree with you about the false views getting their boots on. I mean, part of that is also, and there's been some good work on this in the United States, the image that the Germans created during the war itself. So if you're now making a World War II documentary and you haven't got much money, the easiest thing to do is when you want to illustrate Blitzkrieg, you want to illustrate with German film footage of 1939, 1940, 41 of, Stukas screaming down and marked tanks going across. Nobody ever wants to show you a tank being blown up by an anti-tank gun, which actually, a fair amount of these happened. Or the fact of the matter, which is very interesting, is the number of days after which tanks generally ceased to be effective. You needed, because of course of the actual strain of operations, the way in which you had to often, mend their engines, do work on their tracks, this sort of thing. That isn't a theme in propaganda films of the war.
No, and they're also not showing you pictures of columns of horses either.
No, yes. Well,
because of course the Germans didn't film that. The Germans wanted to convey this image of this mighty mighty Moloch, this kind of sort of enormous war machine. I mean, people always when they're talking about the German military, they always talk about the Nazi war machine, don't they? And what they mean is advancing panzers, half-tracks, Stuka dive bombers, Messerschmitts and all the rest of it.
Well, and modernity as well as the other, which is the other really important thing, which I think is why a lot of the sort of discussion of German kit gets hung up on the advances rather than the things that work. To sort of paraphrase David Jensen, the sort of shock of the old idea of how you win the Second World War, rather than by inventing, for instance, the V2, you're not going to win. You're going to have squandered colossal resources that you could have spent on more tanks, for instance. I mean, that's one of the interesting things. Again, you mentioned that Allied industry the idea that Allied industry overpowers poor old Germany, but the German industry is incredibly fecund, but is being misdirected relentlessly, and over these sort of strange projects that are hung up on modernity.
I agree with you, and can I also say I agree with you entirely. I would also say that, at the present moment there is this unfortunate tradition of in public of being critical about the British war effort. I would say that one of the most important aspects of the strategic bombing, the combined bomber offensive, and of course James has written some wonderful stuff on that in 1944, is that it really interrupts the articulation of the German war industry. If you think about it, Germany is able to draw on the industrial and mineral resources of Europe. So for example, the French war machinery is working. It's the big factories like Billancourt, for example, are producing for the German, compulsorily. The Germans have got something like 9 million slave labourers in Germany. They are drawing on the resources not just of 1937-38 Germany, but of much of occupied Europe. But of course, heavy bombing, and it's interesting, I think the first major industrial site, really big industrial site to be worked over by British bombers is the big marshalling yards at Ham on the eastern end of the Ruhr. This is for a purpose. You often hear attacks on the combined bomber offensive as if in some ways it was a war crime. Well, the fact of the matter was that the German military system, and understandably so, manufacturing was based in large urban areas which were near the coalfields, exactly the same as in Britain. And it's not surprising that if you're bombing marshalling yards, if you're bombing bridges, if you're trying to bomb a plant, then civilians are going to get killed. And no surprise about that. But the bombing offensive, I think, was important. It was strategically very valuable to the Allies. And what it does is it doesn't stop German industrial production increasing into 44. What it does is reduce the rate of its increase, and it also creates inefficiencies, big inefficiencies in terms of trying to, because industry rests on mass production of commodities produced at different sites. That is really handicapped by the attack on the German rail system, and of course on the French rail system. The French rail system is very heavily bombed, and again, in this case, much more of a tragedy that French civilians get killed because they were occupied.
Well, the German railway network, the Reichsbahn, is really the glue that keeps the whole thing together, because they don't have enough fuel, they don't have enough oil, they don't have enough synthetic fuel, and of course coal is what is basically keeping the Third Reich standing up at all. And the rail network is key to the whole thing. It's over which literally everything flows from A to B. And so if you can neutralise that, you're in Stuck. So absolutely. I've never understood these arguments against the strategic air campaign, because self-evidently, if you're bombing lots and lots of locomotives and marshalling yards and railways and blowing up bridges, that is not helpful to your war. That is not helpful to your enemy's war effort, is it?
Yes, and if the Germans are diverting 45% or whatever it is of their effort to building fighters to stop that bomber offensive, they're obviously taking it seriously. They're obviously feeling the pinch, aren't they? And again, they could be building tanks that they need for the Eastern Front or whatever else, but they're building these aircraft because of the bomber campaign.
Yes, and can I add a number of other points? There's a very good essay done some years ago by Neil Gregor on the effect of civilian morale of the bombing of Nuremberg, and arguing this really did hit civilian morale there quite hard. And one of the things to me that's always most interesting about World War II is what happens after. The extent to which there isn't a German resistance movement or a Japanese resistance movement. I think that's very important to Allied success.
That is really interesting.
Now, in part, I think there's the technical reason that the Germans and Japanese had been left in power to surrender. You actually had a legitimate body, obviously vile individual, Admiral Dönitz, but Hitler's designated successor as head of the party, as Vice-Chancellor, as head of the army armed forces to surrender. And of course, we weren't able to do that, or chose not to do it. You can take your point of view in Iraq in 2003, didn't have the opportunity to do it. And the same in Japan, where of course the emperor, surrenders through his ministers. But the point is also, I think that the bombing campaign and the devastation it did bring in the last 6 months of the war in particular helps to destroy any idea of going on resisting. And there's a very interesting recent essay by Tammy Davis Biddle in the Journal of Military History, and she looks at this increase in Allied bombing in the last 6 months. And she links it to growing anxieties on the part of the British and the American governments towards the end of 44 about this issue with German resilience, and in particular, the extent to which the Germans are sort of going on fighting hard, that the Allies know they're trying to produce the Type 21 submarine. They know they are still taking quite heavy civilian casualties from the V2, which goes on, in fact, landing in London till March 1945, and that in a sense that the bombing is intended for a specific set of purposes to end the German determination to go on fighting and to dislocate its economy completely to that end. So as James says, German tanks cannot operate without oil. You also want to really hit the coal production. And if you look at the Allied planning for the early 45 campaign in Germany, it very much focuses on the idea of cutting off the Ruhr and stopping its links into the rest of Germany, so that the Germans will in fact have a coal famine. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that they see this as very consequential. And also, the British and the Americans only have so many troops, and there's a limit. They don't want to have a grinding down attritional warfare.
Well, especially as they've Japan to do.
They've got Japan to do, yes.
Yeah, which is of course the thing that often in assessments of the Western Europe campaign, why are the Allies doing this? They're pulling their punches here, and why aren't they prosecuting this hard enough, or whatever? Why don't they go to Berlin? Well, it's because they may have to invade Kyushu shortly at the end of the year, and they know their casualty projections are basically politically unsustainable. So they're thinking, well, we can't. Bradley's run out of replacements by April 1945. So anyway, now, Jeremy, we keep touching on tanks in this discussion. And am I right in thinking that shortly there's a book about tanks coming from you?
I've got 2 books on World War II coming out. One is on Tank Warfare, which the University of Indiana is publishing, and the other one is World War II in 100 Maps, which British Library Books is publishing in the UK, the University of Chicago in America, and those are 100 maps of the time.
Wow.
And the BL has this series. They've done it already of 100 maps of American history. Susan Schulten did it. And I've tried... Can I just talk briefly about the maps first?
Oh, of course you can. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because with
Total
the maps,
catnip.
what I've tried to do is, if you're writing a book on world, we all know this, and the same as if you're doing a programme. There's good work already out there. You don't want to spend your time just producing footnotes on the good work out there. So, look, there are books of maps on World War II out there. So instead of thinking, okay, how should I do this? Let's start with, planning before the war, then invasion of Poland, blah, 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 blah. Instead of which, what I did was I did it types of maps. So there's maps about strategy, maps on the operational level, maps on the tactical level, maps on the geopolitical level, maps on propaganda, and maps on the press. And then at the end, there's 4 retrospective maps. In other words, for example, the Michelin 1947 map on the Normandy beaches, that's a retrospective map. And what's really interesting is to do that, but also through that, there's also about 50,000 words of text, is writing about the mapping of the war at all those different levels. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, we were arguing in effect that the British and the Americans have been underrated. And I think that's true, because if you're looking at the maps, for example, the British and the Americans are doing a formidable job Now, you're obviously very heavily interested in Europe, so you've got excellent maps, what the British call goings maps. It's a British term. Nobody else uses that precise term. And it basically means what the terrain is like you're going to be crossing. And the British are really good. They get really good at that. But on top of that, the British and the Americans are having to map the world. The Germans don't have to do that. The Japanese don't have to do that. But British units, for example, you know, by 1940 are fighting also on the Kenya-Ethiopia border. They've got to, you know, they're fighting in British Somaliland. They're fighting in Sudan. They're fighting in North Africa, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, the game then goes on. By 1941, you're thinking about where do we get reliable maps for Persia from, for Iran from? Can we use the old ones of the 19th century? What new stuff do we have to put on them? And the actual job there is enormous. So you've got to do the maps. You've got to make them interoperable. So in other words, if you're giving a map of Italy to it's a British-made map, it's got to work for Polish units in the British Army who might have different perceptions of cartography. It's got to work for your American allies. You've got to be able to produce maps also that make sense for somebody flying at great speed above you who's also shit scared of some Messerschmitt on their tail. And it's really very, very impressive, this multi-layered map dimension. The same for the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, the problems are slightly different. They'd shot a lot of their experts in the 30s for a number of reasons. They'd been duffed up in the purges. They'd done terrible things like producing an atlas, which other Soviet demography, which showed that actually the population had gone down, which wasn't Stalin's good news story. But on top of that, they've got to produce maps. So they've got to produce maps of terrain that they have not been on the ground in, or been only very briefly on the ground between 39 and 41, you know, in the Baltics, eastern Poland. And they've actually, much of the Soviet Union was very poorly mapped at this stage. They were in a stage of mapping. So suddenly they've got to produce that as well and make it useful to them. So it's really interesting, the map making that's done, and then the pressures that are put on it, so that the speed of operations increases. That's an enormous pressure. The ranging is increasing. I mean, obviously people knew there were going to be strategic bombing. Nobody actually knew how far you were going to go. People have, during the war, a devising idea of drop tanks for fighter escorts, for example.
Right.
People are, during the war, having to work out how do you coordinate radar information and movable radars, not just stationary radar stations. How do you coordinate that with being in an aircraft and everything is happening around you? So there's a lot of pressures on. And then on that, as I said, the propaganda mapping is fascinating. That's a different level, but it's where you get your images from, how you decide to present them, and what kind of message you're trying to get across. So James has written on the Italy campaign. The Germans, for example, drop maps on the Allies, written in different languages for different Allied units. But the standard image of Italy is a long peninsula, and the Allies are portrayed as snails. So it says how many years to Munich, and this sort of thing. and it's very interesting, because what they're trying to do is engage with a different level of propaganda there. Obviously, propaganda for your own public is one thing. Propaganda trying to affect the opponent. So again, by 44, the Germans are dropping propaganda on England, saying, well, we're killing you with our V1s and none of our people are being killed. You're killing us with your Lancasters and you're losing this many men. And this propaganda mapping is really very, very interesting. And, they put, lines to show how far they exaggerate, but how far their missiles can go. So I found the map book fascinating, really fascinating to do. And I think it's important because it takes us back with the tactical level and the operational level in particular to what troops and commanders would have seen. Because, that in a sense is how you see the terrain. I mean, obviously, with aircraft, you tend to show people photographs. Sometimes you show ground units photographs, but often your ground unit photograph that you don't have, you do for the invasion of Normandy because you've done an enormous amount of preparation. But your average move across, let us say, 10 miles of countryside, you've not got photos of that 10 mile of countryside. So the only way to visualize it is from the maps, and those are really interesting, and the sophistication in them is really very impressive.
Well, Jeremy, I'm doing some work on the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry at the moment, and I've got a facsimile set of all Stanley Christopherson's maps that he was issued with. And he became the commanding officer of the regiment on, I think, the 11th of June, 1944. And they're absolutely fabulous because the detail is absolutely enormous. They're pretty accurate. I mean, I was doing something in Normandy last year, and I was using some of his Normandy maps, and they still worked. I mean,
yes.
Obviously there aren't motorways on or anything, but they're pretty accurate, and it's wonderful to see all the little doodles and stuff. The other thing I was going to say is just the speed with which you're talking about that operational level. I mean, I think within 5 days of landing in Sicily, the Americans had set up a map producing plant operation at Gela or Licata. I can't remember which one it was, but one of those towers. It was all done, and they were producing them. Yes,
both the British and the Americans had mobile map productions units which were fitted into small ones, fitted into lorries, and they could actually do maps, and they could produce maps within 24 hours. In Sicily,
Incredible.
The Americans in advance had done some marvellous mapping, because they were well aware it would be a problem, on water sources, and in particular on wells. And there were maps they produced showing wells that would work all through the year, wells that would map, that would only work for some of the year. And another area which both the Americans and the British mapped in advance for their invasions is they would produce maps showing which terrain they thought you'd be able to put an airbase on.
Yes, I've seen some of those. They're amazing. Well, that's really interesting what you're saying about the water, because in actual fact, within the same period, they've also got a water production plant that's producing 25,000 gallons of water a day.
Oh yeah, well, water is
within 5. Well, of course, it's absolutely vital, but even so, it's just it underlines, doesn't it, that these operations are not just about kind of sort of jumping out of a landing craft and kind of firing your Garand. It's about it's about you've got to think a lot more than just that. And one of the things you do have to think about, of course, is mapping, but you also have to think about water, particularly on somewhere like Sicily, where it's scorching hot. That does sound really interesting.
Can I just add two things on that? To me, the water side is an aspect of what I would say the British and the Americans were very good at, and I call it combat engineering. Because water provision is a form of engineering, just as building Bailey bridges is a form of engineering, just as, for example, being able to put up pumps effectively so that when the Germans break the irrigation ditches near Anzio. So one of the things both the British and the Americans were very good at was combat engineering, and that goes through into the Cold War. So if you look at Cold War planning for conflict against invading Soviet forces in Germany, the Allies turn around, having spent a lot of time during World War II building bridges. They built something like 2,000 Bailey bridges in Italy. Having done that, the combat engineering teams are prepared to destroy the bridges at precisely the right moment. You don't want to leave your troops on the other side of the bloody bridge. And so they've got, but of course, you've got to shoot people at the same time, because, you're going to get Soviet special forces trying to stop you. So that combat engineering side is, to my mind, an aspect of what we're talking about when we're also talking about mapping on the spot, which is the application of knowledge and information. So in other words, what the British and the Americans did, they were very strong on that. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think partly it's their culture, the very strong mechanized skill element in the 1930s, the motor car, the way in which so many people had mechanized skills in those societies, which were much more industrial, less agricultural than, say, the German society. But also, I think it's partly because a lot of the British and American commanders, particularly the British commanders, had a lot of experience in latter stage of World War I as essentially artillery generals. and they saw and they thought in terms of being able to use force in order to move across terrain. So the terrain force ratio is not one in which you express it with, sweeping movements of hundreds of miles. And I think for a British commander, the idea that you get the sappers to do this, you put down the firepower to do that, you move forward to get through that lot of woodland by 6 o'clock, that, I think, was very much part of the way many of them had been trained and had won their experience. I think that's very important.
We're just going to take a quick break. We're talking to Jeremy Black. See you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways. We're talking to Jeremy Black. And this is a wide-ranging digression fest.
Well, tank warfare, what I've done is and the reason I wrote these for American publishers is bluntly because I wanted to reach out to a broader market. Some years ago, and I started with Rowman and Littlefield, I wrote a series of books I did one on air warfare, one on combined operations, one on fortification, one on insurrections, one on naval warfare since 1860. And now I've done tanks with Indiana. And what I wanted to do in each case is to say, these are important elements of war, but one of the problems is that in each case, the classic example is air warfare, they are written about only by people completely 100% convinced that, as one of my former students who went into the Air Force said, they had 6 lectures. The first lecture was on how the Air Force won World War I. The second lecture was on the Air Force won World War II, and so on. So what I wanted to do was to actually say these are important, but the way in which you understand significance is contextualizing it. So if you take tanks, I start off obviously at the beginning, and I have quite a lot, apart from discussing the early stages, but quite a lot on Fuller, JFC Fuller, and his ideas, not just Plan 1919, but his ideas, his writings immediately after the war, in which he looks to the future and he describes how, Britain is going to be invaded by tanks that go under the English Channel, and, how you will, next time you invade Afghanistan, you will be able to do it with tanks, and, therefore you'll have very low casualties, etc., etc. Now, the point about it is not, it's easy to poke fun of that, but the point is that what Fuller captured in that is a sense that if you just look at a weapon system without considering it in terms of its possible constraints, you go hopelessly wrong. So, by the end of World War I, it was already apparent that tanks, exactly as you would expect, this is nothing wrong with tanks, that they were vulnerable to 3 principal problems. One, their own malfunctions, which is exactly what you'd expect of any mechanical system. 2, the problems of operating across the physical terrain, which again is exactly what you'd expect in any mechanical system. And 3, the nature of the opposition. Now, in a way, if you roll on towards World War II, you have that, as it were, tension between the idea of the tank as something like the aircraft, which is going to deliver you a strategic outcome without you having to really think through all the multiplicity of tactical and operational factors that you're considering about. Now, you mentioned, for example, you were spot on the need for oil if you're looking at tanks. You're absolutely spot on about that. So that a tank works if you have a very good backup system of repair, of maintenance, but also of supply. And I think it's fair to say that, not surprisingly, under the pressure of war, it took a while for all of these to come into play. I think by 1945, the British and the Americans and the Soviets very clearly in Manchuria, are very good at maintaining, sustaining and supplying tank forces that are able to carry out operational goals. And I think they're doing that very well. I think it's fair to say that it's not easy to do that in the state of the tanks in 39. And everybody makes big song and dance about the Germans breaking through in 40. Well, to a great extent, that was because the actual friction of opposition was relatively limited, because so many of the core and elite British and French units were to the north, engaging in what they thought was going to be the direction or axis of German attack.
Mm.
Yes, but also it's because because very sensibly the Germans are not using their tanks as major means of providing firepower. They're working together with motorised infantry and motorised reconnaissance vehicles and motorised artillery.
Well, and after all,
the Panzer Division is a combined arms unit.
Yes,
and although it is called a Panzer Division, and although we, the French and the British call it an armoured division, the German one is not just stuff full of tanks, because their other infantry divisions are walking on their own 2 feet or using horses. And obviously that's not going to work. So you've got to come up with another structure that enables your panzers to operate. And the only way you can do that is by motorising all the other elements that you need to support that tank. The tanks themselves, as you point out very clearly in your book, are pretty flimsy in 1939, 40, 41. It's not till the second half of the war that we're starting to talk about kind of Tiger tanks and Panthers, which have become the kind of sort of, the leitmotif of the Second World War. But actually, it's not really representative at all.
Yes, I think that's right. And also, by the end of the war, you're getting better tank destroyers. Tank destroyers that can take a blow hard and still keep going. Can I just say another reason? I agree with you entirely. Another reason, which I think is often underplayed, why panzer divisions bring everything together, is that minimises the supply issue. You can focus your provision of petrol on and that's quite important, because the Germans didn't have an enormous backup in petrol provision, and I think that's quite significant. Interestingly enough, if you want to go to the modern day, as you may know, there's a debate at the present moment about whether the British Army should continue with its tanks. Now, listeners will have their own different views on where they think things should go. But one of the interesting problems for the British Army at the moment is we're short of tank transporters. And we actually are about 100 tank transporters below what we need to be. So in many senses, you've often got to look at your backup systems. And you see, this has become much greater an issue. I mean, this gives you an analogy, obviously very different political context, to the analogy facing the Germans. From 1945 to 1990, the British Army on the Rhine, its armour was principally around Osnabrück. It had good tank repair facilities and a relatively short supply chain. At the present moment, the NATO commitment is to defend the eastern frontiers of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia and Poland, where there are a host of problems in terms of supply network and distance, but also, for example, the actual strength of bridges. There's a whole host of problems, which people need. And, you're not going to get a chance to build a bridge with the Russians just sitting around doing absolutely nothing. And these kind of factors, and this was the sort of factor that affected the Wehrmacht when it invaded the Soviet Union. It's not just the Soviet resistance. It's actually that the supply of fuel has to go much further to get to them. Not easy.
Well, this is the culmination point, isn't it? The point by which you can no longer operate to the standards that you've set yourself, because your line of supply is so great that all that Bewegungskrieg, that kind of sort of that war of speed and rapid manoeuvre, is just, the wheels are literally falling off because you're just too far from your supply bases. I mean, I'm just looking at this pamphlet here, which is German tank maintenance in World War II. And I mean, really, it should be called lack of German tank maintenance in World War II. I mean, what's really interesting about it is they have everything set up to do all this. They just don't have the infrastructure to enact it. There's a guy called Adolf, I think he's von Schell, who was put in charge of He was general plenipotentiary of motorised vehicles in the Wehrmacht, and boy, did he have a kind of tough job on his hand. Of course, he was constantly, firefighting, running uphill. It was just completely insolvable because, if you look at Operation Barbarossa, you've got 2,000 different vehicles.
Yes.
It's all very well the Germans being smug about all those Morris commercials and Citroen vans and things that they've captured in 1940, but they all require different distributor caps and point systems and coils and all the other little things. So, and when you're kind of 350 miles from what had been the Polish border, you've got a problem on your hands. You can't just deal with it. And if your tank doesn't work and your Panzerfaust can't be the spearhead that it is, then it isn't. And therefore you're going to lose. And suddenly all those things that make you special have gone.
Well, you're right. There's another aspect, in particular on fuel, but also on mechanics, who there's an enormous shortage of in Germany. It's the real struggle between the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht. One of the things the Luftwaffe insists on is first call on fuel, and on they're trying to move their airfields further forward both in Barbarossa, but also earlier in the attack on the west. And the Wehrmacht saying quite reasonably, well, we need this, these facilities, and the Luftwaffe says no. And one of the interesting things about the German system is it really doesn't cater well for differences like that. It really doesn't. In a way, Hitler has consolidated all power on himself, and then actually is a lazy and rather stupid man, and doesn't. Well, he is.
I don't disagree.
There's a dysfunctional centre, and then obviously you can add to that other agencies like the SS, other agencies that are got their own views. Operation Tot, for example, has its own views on its call on resources, and it makes it very, very difficult. And there are faults and flaws in the Allies. We would be idiots to deny that. But the Allies are getting pretty good at running Joint Chiefs of Staff systems, both centrally, but also actually in particular areas. Now, you do have the principal Allied dysfunctionality, I would suggest. Everybody talks up the row between, Montgomery and all the rest of it. The Americans love having a go. Actually, the principal dysfunctionality in command terms for the British and the Americans in World War II is that between MacArthur and the Navy in the Pacific. And that is no, because
I know you're absolutely right.
And MacArthur is a much more problematic figure and much harder to control than Montgomery, or Patton for that matter. And what I find highly ironic is that people don't make that comparison, because one that would have been bloody obvious to somebody like Marshall, and you could argue, again, if you want to press this further, there are disagreements and tensions between the British and the Americans. We know all about them, about Dragoon and about whether the Balkan strategy should be pursued, etc., etc. They, again, are as nothing about this question of is it really sensible to get involved in the Philippines? Because to go back to what Al was saying earlier and you were saying earlier, there was a tremendous shortage of troops for the invasion of Japan that was projected. Well, if you're looking at American army divisions, and you've got to think not just of casualties through Japanese action, but actually casualties through tropical disease, the Philippines, and you could argue the latter stages of the New Guinea campaign, because what the hell was the point of the latter stages of the New Guinea campaign, are taking far more troops out. And again, I'm not being anachronistic. That row was made at the time, as we know, both within the Americans, but also, for example, there was an analogous Australian row, because the Australians sent troops into Borneo in 1945. And there was a lot of questions in Australia, is what are we exactly doing this for? In a sense, the American Navy has already cut the route so the Japanese can't move.
So just leave them there to rot,
Just leave them there to rot. And if we are going to use troops, surely, as Al is saying, we should be focusing those on what happens about occupying the Japanese home islands. So it's very interesting, this. If what you're assuming, and I think you're correct to assume, is that the war is going to end with a war against Japan, and, you might say to me, well, that's a silly thing to say. What would have happened if it had gone wrong in Normandy? And I tell you what I think would have happened. I think what would have happened if D-Day had not worked is the first atom bomb would have been dropped on Berlin. I mean, and I think would have killed Hitler. So, and that would have been the end of the Reich. But the point is that, given that you're assuming, I think correctly, that Japan is going to be the problem at the end. And remember, there are Japanese troops over an enormous area. So what you've got to do, you have with Japan to be able to inflict such a serious defeat on Japan itself that Japanese units everywhere else who you're not even planning to attack, where there's no plan, serious plan. There are plans, but there's no serious and short-term plan to attack the Japanese in Java. There's no serious short-term plan to attack the enormous garrison in Rabaul or the garrison in Truk. There is no plan that is going to actually defeat the Japanese army in southern China. It's just been beating the Kuomintang. So the only way to get these forces to surrender is to actually get the Japanese government to fall. The only way you can be certain the Japanese government is going to fall is to have the ability to plan for an invasion. Now, as we know, the atom bombs are going to deal with this, but people weren't able to be certain it would have that consequence, and there was not an enormous number of other atom bombs available. So they did definitely have to plan for these, and they were going to really need soldiers. They had been shocked at how many men were lost on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Absolutely shocked. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that just as the growing intensity of Allied bombing of Germany in the last 6 months of the war, which includes the bombing of Dresden, of course, is explained by the strength of German resistance and the failure of Germany to collapse in 1944. So in my view, what absolutely determines the use of atom bombs, beyond any question of a doubt, is the strength of the Japanese resistance on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. And one other episode which really affected American public opinion, and that was the going down of the Indianapolis. I don't know if you recall that. It was on the front page of all the, well, for the benefit of listeners that don't recall it, the Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser, it had a very large crew. I mean, one of the reasons American warships at the end of the war have very large crews is because they're very heavily manned with anti-aircraft guns against kamikaze pilots. It's very large. The ship is sunk by a Japanese submarine. The vast majority of the crew survive and are then eaten by sharks in the water. And it was a horrific episode. And I think, and it was fully reported in the American press. And I think the combination of the, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, the Indianapolis going down, I think that
they
the
Americans...
thought
we just got to stop this now.
Yes, I think they just thought we've got to stop this now. But you see, I think this helps to also throw a light on the problem that MacArthur posed, that in a way, the logical strategic axis, the initial plans, as you know. Oh, actually, I've also got a book coming out. I'd forgotten about that. Next year, I've got a book on strategy in World War II, which Little Brown is publishing. But as you know, the initial plans for air attack on Japan was that the air attack was to come from China. The point is that, yes, you can fly planes off aircraft carriers, including obviously, army planes, as Doolittle did, which I think came off the Hornet. But none of those planes could be retrieved. They had to fly on to China. And, your load is limited. If you want really heavy loads, you need to fly off a landing runway. And So the initial plans was for China, and that was one of the major reasons, as apart from supporting the Chinese government, for the enormous effort put into sustaining the over the hump, as it's called, over the Himalayas, building up these airfields. A lot of the supplies was for building up the airfields. And of course, the Japanese launched an offensive in mid-42, which did a certain amount of damage, but then a very big offensive in 45, Operation Ichigo, which showed the vitality of the Japanese army at that stage. And even by 44, beginning of 44, even before the American airfields fell, if you look, as I've done, at the maps of the range in which you could fly and come back. And remember, all maps are slightly approximate because you don't know about wind conditions. You have to factor those in. But all of the maps assuming that essentially the range from the Chinese air bases they're going to have, remember they didn't have air bases in Manchuria or anything, is going to take you at best over southern Japan. It's not going to take you over central Japan. So essentially, the Navy route in the Pacific, with the attempt to create, the air bases around Saipan, is it gives you air bases from which you can bomb central Japan as well. In fact, you can actually bomb into northern Japan, but nobody's really interested in bombing at Hokkaido. But you can bomb into central Japan as well. And that is really important. There's not much benefit once you know that you're not going to be reliant on a China strategy of seizing the Philippines. Yes, you get air bases at Clark Field. Yes, you get Luzon and the capacity to mass shipping there, and that shipping would help you. There's no doubt at all it would help you, no doubt at all, it would help you for invading Japan. But if you're going to have over 120,000 troops tied up in the Philippines when you're going to be short of army manpower, this ain't brilliant. This really ain't brilliant. And I think MacArthur is a problem. We know what he's going to be like in 1950. It was already apparent that he was a problem in 44. There is the argument, I don't know if you know this argument, I mention it in my strategy book. There is the argument that Roosevelt knew that he needed to be got rid of, but wanted him to stay in command so he couldn't run for the Republicans in 44. I don't know. Is that
really true?
I don't know. I don't know if it's really true. It's an argument that has been made. MacArthur was a political figure. He had, before he went to the Philippines, when he'd been chief of staff in the early 30s, he had political links. He, of course, was to be discussed vaguely as a potential Republican candidate for 52. I don't know. But it's certainly the case that Roosevelt was uneasy about MacArthur. And of course, there was the direct example of 1864 when, Lincoln sacks McClellan as commander of the Potomac. McClellan then runs for the Democrats in the 64 presidential against Lincoln. So, it is, it's an issue if you're going back in 1847. The Americans have gone into Mexico in the north. Under Zachary Taylor, they've done quite well in 46. In 47, Polk pulls away the troops from that, any more troops, and instead gives the troops to Scott for an amphibious attack at Veracruz and march directly on Mexico City from there, because he's worried, there's no two ways about that, he's worried about Taylor's presidential and political ambitions. I don't know.
Well, there's also absolutely no question at all that MacArthur's a hugely ambitious man. But Jeremy, we've got to wind up now. We're overrunning, but
well, let's do this again. Let's do it again.
Let's do this again. Yes, absolutely.
For the strategy, when your strategy book out, it would be great to get you back on. Yeah, I kind of had a feeling this was going to be pretty wide ranging, and so it's proved to be. But
can I just say that makes it interesting. And you've got to remember, people like Churchill, people like Roosevelt had a historical memory. Roosevelt had been involved in American politics for a while. He knew a lot about he was about the navalism of the 19 teens. Churchill himself had been in government, since virtually these people have a historical. So have Stalin. Stalin, for God's sake, had written a history book. I mean, these people, the Japanese plan essentially is to rerun the Russo-Japanese War. So these people, they are using new machinery, and we have to understand this new machinery, but they are also using it in terms of their idea of the strategic geography and culture of their state. And that is framed in part by historical debate.
Amazing.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Completely.
Let's do this again.
Entirely.
Couldn't agree more.
We'll do it again.
But that's been absolutely fantastic, and I can't quite get over what we've covered in 59 minutes. But it's been
fantastic,
been pretty broad.
Brilliant.
It's been wonderful, Jeremy. Thank you.
Well, if you send me a link, I shall look at it, and I will send it to various family members and things, so I'll be grateful. But greetings to everybody, and just to say to people, you don't have to buy my books. I hope they'll be available in libraries or things, but there are a lot on military history, and my view is war is so important that you cannot leave discussion of war simply to people who think it's a sort of a pathology, or think that it's all expressed as a product of, as it were, male inadequacy, or the strength of manufacturing systems, whatever. You need to understand war as a complex process, and we need to actually honour the memory of those who risked their life. History is a trust between the generations by taking them seriously and not writing them off. I think that's very important.
Well,
what better note to end on? I completely agree.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Cheerio.